the core in trying to avoid the extreme climate impacts, that there should be an immediate end to investment in fossil fuels. But the discussion is that, is Africa ready to bring an end to fossil fuels immediately? Or what should be the approach moving forward? The other issue for debate is really that there's an expectation that with regards to climate action, African countries have to respond in the same way as developed countries. So if it's the phasing out of coal, it has to be immediate. If everybody's doing it immediately, then we also have to do it immediately. But we have to then have a discussion around that, that is Africa ready to actually make that transition immediately? There are also concerns that the cost of this transition may outweigh the benefits without proactive management, particularly in the African context. Another important aspect is whether African households are going to actually afford these alternative energy sources. So ahead of the COP27 climate summit in Egypt, it's important that we make clear, very clear recommendations which are people-centered with regards to how this agenda around the just energy transition, is going to be implemented. How will African countries proactively manage that transition to avoid creating new injustices? There are a lot of existing injustices. So how can we ensure that we are not creating new injustices? So we would like to know from our panelists how the energy transition will contribute to delivering a future that will be fair, that will be sustainable, but also contributes to the climate neutrality, globally. We know that the energy transition will bring about a lot of changes, and we would like, through this conversation, really to just unpack some of those critical issues. So I would now like to bring in our panelists at this juncture, and I would like to start with Prof. Claude. There is an acceleration with regards to pushing towards the renewable energies. What are really the key drivers towards this push? And with the rapid expansion of renewable energies, I would like you to just highlight whether African households could really actually afford alternative energy sources. And I would just like you to share from the work that you have been doing as the Southern Africa Resource Watch. Claude? Claude, are you still on the call? Is Claude still on the call?
Seems Claude has dropped off.
Okay.
He does not appear on the list of panelists anymore. He was on just a moment ago.
Okay. So maybe I can just move on to you, Alex, while we wait for Claude to come back. If you could just share from your side in terms of the transitioning to this renewable energy. Currently, for South African context, we can't even power our current grid, and we're talking about transitioning to renewable energy sources for our power. What's your reflection in terms of the South African energy crisis in the context of this conversation, but also just share some reflections on the South Africa's Just Transition Partnership, which is supposed to support the decarbonization efforts? What will be the plans moving forward? Alex?
Perfect. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the introduction you gave me earlier. The surname, I always say, if you can say Frankenstein, it's close enough to Benkenstein. Okay, so our audience today is not exclusively South Africans. So maybe to start, it's just to back up a little bit and provide a little bit of context. I think most participating today would know that South Africa is very heavily reliant on coal for electricity production. So about 85% of our electricity production is coal-based. It's very important not only for electricity production, but also for jobs. So mining jobs, Coal is also a major export product for South Africa. And through that, again, revenues. So the question of transitioning towards renewable energies is really a critical issue for South Africa, also in the context of extremely high rates of inequality and unemployment, and also skill shortages. Then the question of load shedding, you've heard the reference to South Africa's electricity crisis. Essentially, demand for electricity exceeds supply, and the only way that that can be managed currently in the very short term is through load shedding. Now, load shedding is not a countrywide blackout. It's essentially a scheduled system of power cuts, geographically managed. Slight silver lining there is that it is predictable in the sense that we move through various levels. Through one, we're currently at stage 6, which at stage 6, you're talking about up to 3 power cuts of about 2.5 hours each. Now, again, I'm getting stuck on the context, but I do want to emphasize the extreme financial cost to the economy of the energy crisis that we're experiencing. So that's been estimated at about $30 million US dollars per stage per day. So when we move to stage 6, like we have had for the past few days, we're talking about $180 million a day that's being lost. And then the question of, we've got this current energy crisis, is now the time to be talking about a transition away from coal-based power. We have the coal power generation infrastructure. Should we not just stick with what we know? I think the research is clear. It's a bit like planting a tree. When's the best time to have planted a tree? Probably 20 years ago. It's the same thing with our investment in renewable energies. We could have done a lot more, a lot sooner, and that would have made a big difference to the situation we're in today. But if you haven't planted a tree yet, the second best time to plant a tree is today. And I think it's a similar situation. And we are seeing rapid movements in the markets, in the policy environments. And I think that stems from a recognition that really we've been moving too slowly, and that's part of what's brought us into this crisis. I also just want to say that an energy crisis of the kind that South Africa is experiencing is not a crisis like a cyclone or a drought. This is very much a manufactured crisis. It's a crisis that has emerged out of failures in planning and failures to make tough political decisions at the right time for the country. And I think we do need to remember that. Now, we have had a renewable energy independent power producers procurement program for a number of years. And that program has already shown us that when the regulatory system is in place, the role that government can play in de-risking investments, the ability at a very fast pace to unlock capital, to unlock investment in renewable energy production, that is there. Yes, we're sitting with a crisis. Renewable energy, wind, solar is one of the fastest, certainly cost competitive these days, ways to ramp up production. And again, the regulatory changes that we've seen, for example, the government allowing now up to 100 megawatts of own production before lifting the licensing threshold, for own production up to 100 megawatts. Also allowing municipalities to engage in their own power procurement contracting, and the municipalities have moved ahead, have announced programs or are taking the step forward. So again, I think the future that we're moving into is more decentralized power production, and it's a more yes, true, admittedly complex picture, but it's where we need to move, where we're not relying on a single centralized power producer, but that there are multiple energy production procurement programs happening. Some of our large energy intensive industries, individual companies coming forward with very ambitious plans and existing investments into building in renewable energies. So there's another, I mean, there've been some very interesting reports coming out recently. A report released by Meridian Economics showing that if we had an additional 5 gigawatts of renewable energy production in place by 2021 for last year, that actually could have prevented about 95% of the load shedding that we experienced last year. And again, yes, we all complain about the inconvenience, but let's not forget, we're talking about millions, billions of dollars of cost to the economy. We're talking about impacts on jobs in a country that really cannot afford it. So that study, and I would suggest I might share the link a little bit later, but that study was very interesting in that it showed that, in fact, if we had increased renewable energy production, instead of creating turbulence in the current system that is so reliant on coal productions, it would have actually made the system operate more efficiently. It could have reduced that load shedding. It would have saved Eskom $2.5 billion. Because of course, when there's load shedding, when there's energy production crisis, there's a big shift towards diesel generated power, and that is extremely expensive. So yeah, these are the questions that we need to ask. The second part of your question was around the just transition question. And I could probably assume that most of the audience are broadly familiar with what we mean when we say a just transition, but broadly it's recognizing that as we move away from fossil fuels towards renewable energies, there are going to be costs. It will involve, as industries, coal mining, coal-based power manufacture, as we move away from that, it is going to result in job losses in certain sectors. And we need to be very clear-eyed about that. We need to be open about that, and then ensure that we implement measures at various levels of society to promote just transition. In other words, to minimize the costs of this transition, particularly thinking about those that are most hard hit, the marginalized in community, those with less existing economic abilities, skills base, and so forth. And so reduce the costs, but also increase the opportunities in terms of job opportunities, investment opportunities in the transition, in the green economy, in renewable energy sectors. Now, fortunately, in South Africa, I think that debate has advanced in really interesting ways, and I think it's a model that maybe some of our audience members from other parts of the continent could look into. There's a presidential climate commission that was appointed specifically to focus on this question of a just transition, and they only recently, in May this year, brought forward, after extensive consultations and research, brought forward a just transition framework. Now that will inform ongoing discussions within the country across all sectors and at multiple levels about how to deal with these costs and also to take advantage of the opportunities. Obviously, part of that is going to be addressing skills and reskilling. It's one thing to say, you know, that with some investment in education and reskilling, that the job losses in the coal sector would be compensated by gains in the renewable energy or the green economy. Once you dive down into the specifics, quite a complex picture emerges. We must recognize that the economic activity is very geographically concentrated. for the coal sector, for example, in Mpumalanga. So we need to look very closely at the kind of ground level microeconomic dynamics that play out in particular communities and particular geographic settings. Again, I think South Africa's engagement with that, if we look at some of the research that's being done, some of the engagement with research institutions, NGOs, government agencies, that kind of granular analysis is being done. Of course, more can be done, but I do think that we are seeing a level of engagement that is certainly not just at a superficial level, and that's what's going to be required. And again, I think that's a lesson for other regions. The other element to consider is that we also do need to look strategically further into the future and ask ourselves, well, you know, the regulatory environment around South Africa getting involved in global our trade relationships and other elements. This is where the future of competitiveness lies. So this is where we need to invest. This is where we need to be creating opportunities. I think that's sufficient for an initial statement. And as the conversation goes, I'll add. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you've just raised some very critical points. One of the key issues around planning, you know, and how are we planning, you know, this transition. I'll just invite participants to share questions, comments through the chat, and then we'll be able to pick up the questions and share them with the panelists. I'm going to now invite Claude to come into the conversation. And just for you to just share your reflections in terms of what is really pushing the acceleration with regards to the renewable energy, the key drivers. Alex has really just shared and provided a perspective in terms of how, from the South African context, and how they have really been planning around the renewable energy program. And it's something which started, you know, from years back, and the process that the country is going through. But the last 2-3 years, there's just been such a big push towards the renewable energy. And what are the key drivers? And who's really driving this agenda? And also to just share from the work that you have been doing, whether, as we are pushing for this, are African households able to actually afford these alternative energy sources? Claude? You're on mute?
No, thank you so much to the Southern Africa Trust for the invitation to be on this very interesting and important dialogue. I want to apologize for my unstable connection, but I hope it will not disappoint us. Just not to waste a lot of time, I think I just want to make a few observations before I respond to some of your questions. I draw no line between climate change and energy transition. My sense is that they are both sides of the same coin. We need energy transition to resolve climate change crisis. And when you look at climate change in the African context, when you look at the floodings around the continent, the drought, is probably the most difficult challenge facing the African continent. And it has the potential to derail and reverse the continent's modest development achievement for the past decade. So climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts have a particular significance for Africa, not because Africa has polluted the atmosphere, simply because Africa is the most vulnerable in terms of responding because of its low adaptive capacity and the absence of effective responses. And we will have to understand that, to answer to your question of household adaptation, that's, I think, the most important issue we will have to resolve, not only in the context of Africa, but in the context of the global economy. So the key drivers of climate change are both natural and human factors. But when you look at the science, it seems like natural factors, human factors, are far more are key factors that are behind warming up the atmosphere. And scientists are very convinced that human activities are key drivers through the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and to the atmosphere. So, and one of the biggest factor, and Alex referred to, and you also referred to in your introduction, is the fossil fuel, your coal, your oil, your gas. Then mining becomes a key driver of climate change. And the Southern Africa Resource Watch invests in understanding the governance of mining sector and its impact on socioeconomic issues. So the work we do, and Christabel will allow me, I won't respond directly to each of your questions. I will build my answer, you'll find answers in as I go about trying to really explain the challenges that households on the African continent are facing and will be facing in the future. So beside the fossil fuel, which when you look at the Southern Africa, let's take the case of Southern Africa, or let's take the continent. You have Nigeria, you have Algeria, you have Gabon, you have Cameroon, you have Gabon, you have DRC, you have Angola, you have producing oil. And this is one of the biggest contributor to their economy. You take oil from Nigeria, you kill the Nigerian economy. You take coal from South Africa, you bring darkness to South Africa, and so on and so forth. So beside the fossil fuel, you have other activities such as agriculture and deforestation. And you take the Congo forest, which is the second biggest forest in the world after the Amazon, which are an important reservoir. And when you look at the deforestation that is going on, it's presenting a serious challenge. And the solution has to become, how do you stop that deforestation? But how do you then respond to the people who their livelihood depends on that? And you have a Congolese state that is so weak to respond to people's need and cannot, in its current nature, present an alternative to these communities that depend on that forest, either for their agriculture, either for their medicine, either for fishing and so on. So you have those challenges. So the argument that is that climate change is then destroying the world as we know it, and we need to stop these activities which are eating up the atmosphere, and then how do we then do that in the mix of these challenges where Africa has no capacity to respond and to adapt in these current conditions? And the question, I think, which is important to pose at this stage is that we have a very unequal world and very divided. When we move to new economy, the economy built on a new type of energy, because climate change provides us with an opportunity to build a total new economy. Do we move with these inequalities, which we have failed to resolve in the current economies? And I think that is a fundamental question, because then if we don't resolve the question of equity in this transition, and we allow the transition to happen within the context of global inequality, and where Africa is the most vulnerable but the least polluter, then we are going to build a very unstable world. Africa is also the reservoir of these critical minerals needed to realize a lower carbon future and the manufacture of cleaner energy technologies. You will know that Africa has got the biggest reserve of cobalt. 70% of it is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC supplies 60% of the world cobalt. The DRC, Zimbabwe have got the biggest reserve of lithium, which are also needed for batteries for electrical cars. We've got manganese on the continent. We've got all these critical minerals that are needed to achieve this cleaner energy technology. So it seems to me, before Chair, I pose another question. It seems to me that climate change is an opportunity for Africa to move off an economy path not built on export of raw materials, as we've seen it over the centuries, where Africa has been the export of raw materials and the import of manufacturing goods. And in the current climate change context, Africa might become an exporter of a new technology, but an import of technology, which is going to perpetuate the dependence of Africa on the rest of the world in terms of what is important if its own survival, but it is the producer of those critical minerals. So the extractive industry, the mining sector, is a key sector capable of unlocking inclusive growth and unlocking development on the continent if we use those critical minerals to our advantage. It is a sector that is critical in our effort to build the climate change, the resilience and mitigation. My sense is that there's a bigger question that as Africans we need to answer in this discourse of climate change, energy transition. And your first question was: is the energy transition is happening expanding very fast? What we need to ensure is that it should not lock African people out of those benefits. As we have seen it with all the industrial revolution we've experienced so far, is that every time Africa has been marginalized, Africa has been abandoned, and Africa has been at the core the biggest loser in most of this industrialization. If it means and I want to be very careful when I say this. I think Africa needs to protect its interest, the interest of those households, Christabel, you are talking about, who have no access to energy today. But if we are going to transit to new energy, how do we secure that those poor people in Mansa in Zambia, in Ngezi in Zimbabwe, somewhere in the Congo, how do we ensure that those women access to this energy? So my sense is that if it means slowing it down until we agree on the terms of the transition that benefits people in Mansa in Zambia, in Ngezi in Zimbabwe, in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, then we need to do that. Because my sense is that, and the question maybe, to put differently, which take all your four questions, is how will then Africa really benefit from the energy transition? And the current global economy model in which Africa has been locked in will not allow households, those women who depend on the forests for their fire. It will not. So the poor African population, how do we ensure that they benefit from the transition? And here, Alex has provided a much bigger macroeconomic argument in terms of finances. And that is an argument that we've been locked in, where our government are more prone to ask for funding to ensure energy transition. But we know that the world is not prepared to give Africa the billion and billion that we need for the entire continent to transit at the same pace, have the same access to this new energy. So the current structure of the world economy will only ensure the benefits of climate change to go to developed countries, developed world which control the technology. So the entire issue about energy transition is not finances. It is control of the technology that create that new energy. So we need an approach that reestablish equity in the distribution of those benefits, but it cannot happen automatically. It cannot happen by accident. We will need to fight for it. Africa will need to fight for it as a united front. I have the impression that African leaders, you see at COP26, there were divisions. South Africa got some money. The DRC says we are the biggest, we are the solution country for energy transition. We've got the forest that you need, with the critical minerals that you need, but you are not giving us the money to ensure that that transitions happen in our country. But South Africa is happy that they can move away from coal, but it's that division at that level that will undermine Africa access to a stable new energy and clean energy. So my argument is that we need a united front to achieve that. But that united front is not about necessarily asking for financing. It's about how do we use our comparative advantage today, which is that we have in our control all the critical minerals that are needed to transit to new energy. That's one. And that brings to my last question, is to what extent then is climate change informing the Africa's development path? Are we situating this energy transition within the African economic development, within our vision that we have, the Agenda 2063 does it articulate correctly our position around climate change? When we talk about climate just transition, it's not just about energy transition. I think we need to be very clear, because that's where it's not just about energy transition. Otherwise, we will be missing the opportunity that this climate change is bringing. It is about transition of economics, because climate change is going to create a new type of economy. So it's about transition to new economy, which will have social, economic, and impact on communities that will lose their land, might lose their fisheries rights, their workers will lose their work, jobs will be difficult to create if we have to transit for fossil fuel. So that's totally a new economy. How our countries, individually and collectively, are positioning our economies within this complex challenges. So there is need, I think, and for Africa, as far as climate change strategy is concerned, to articulate its own Green Deal and use the minerals it has in abundance to achieve that. My sense is that you look at the African Union, you look at the level of African regional blocks, we don't have a very clear and united articulation of our Green Deal. What is it that we want exactly as a continent? Cristobal, you say, are we prepared to move away from fossil fuel? That's a question most of the countries have not seriously responded to. And our work, just to put in our work is exactly that. We are trying to help and discuss with this government, produce papers where these governments start to articulate their position at the country level, but we also want a position at the SADC level, which says, for us, with our gas or oil or coal, this is how we foresee the transition and how long it's going to take us. And Alex made it very clear in the case of South Africa, there are contradictions even within government. If it has to be immediate and how long it will take. So those contradictions do not send a correct signal to the rest of the world on our position. So my sense, and I'm going to conclude, Cristobal, on this position, is that Africa needs to create its own technology. We need to create battery alliance, hydrogen technology, to ensure that it is strategically positioned to derive maximum benefits from the global lithium battery industry. The batteries we are talking about are not just batteries for cars. Those batteries can also power energy for villages and so on. So I think there is need for us to reflect. Africa cannot continue to provide resources for clean energy for others, but not for itself, considering the abundance of the resources. Let me conclude on this first opportunity to say the strategy is then to move Africa beyond extracting minerals to processing them to create segment of batteries manufacturing value chain on the continent. But you will need a leadership, a strong leadership, a courageous leadership, and ready to move with that direction. I think the capacity is there, we've got the resources, and I think the finances are also there, because Zambia and the DRC, as I'll speak to as we move forward, have agreed to put up structures and to put up plants to start manufacturing batteries for electrical cars. They need support. They need support from the continent, and they need support from the world so that we create equity in the distribution of benefits from climate change. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Some very good good points that you have raised. I've just been writing notes, critical issues that we need to discuss in the continent. One of the key statements is to looking at our comparative advantage. What do we have? What resources do we have? How do we work together? Which brings us back to the point that Alex raised in terms of planning. We have the resources, we have the minerals. How do we ensure that this agenda is really people-centered? And how do we phase it? In terms of within our capacities and as we develop new capacities. I think another critical point that you've raised is in terms of the control of technology. This is really a big issue. Who is going to control that technology? And even if we are receiving support from outside the continent, who's going to control that, and at what cost is it going to come to the African continent? I think you've raised some very critical issues, and I will go to the chat to look at some of the questions that have come through, but I would like to bring in Trusha at this point to really now take it to the next level. So we are talking about climate justice. I think Claude has kind of raised some of those issues that we should be looking at how citizens and people within the communities are going to be integrated into all these conversations. So climate justice is really a central principle to really guiding this just energy transformation. We should be at a stage in the continent 5 years or 10 years from now that we have made progress in decarbonizing, but poverty and inequality is reducing because we've involved everybody through the whole process. We need to also talk about the aspect of access to justice, which is essential as we are having all these plans. How are people being involved in those conversations? What mechanisms are there to protect the livelihoods of people? So even if we say there will be no cutting of trees, what happens in terms of the livelihoods of those people and what mechanisms should be in place? Can you just share from the work that Womena has been doing and the research that you've been doing on this aspect?
Thanks so much, Christabel. It's great to be with you all here again and to have been invited again by the Southern Africa Trust to speak on some of these issues, particularly from the perspective of my organization called Women African Alliance and the work that we do, which is really trying to support the development of or the building of a women's movement on this continent in Africa, to resist destructive extractivism and to start proposing and advancing alternative development solutions. So I think I should maybe just start with something that I think is sort of very well known, but I think, and others on the panel have also pointed out, but I think should always be said and should always be put into this context whenever we talk about climate justice, the just energy transition. And it's really that we are living in a really critical time and a dire time, in fact, where we're faced with the climate crisis, the defining issue, of course, as we know, of our time. And it's intersecting in really difficult and big ways with other crises that we're facing on this continent, other crises of health, of the economy, the debt crisis that we're faced with, and so on. And really, and I think what Christabel's sort of pointing to here is that we need to rise up in real ways to actually meet this challenge and build this on climate justice. Particularly looking at not replicating the fundamental errors that have been made in the future, which has actually caused these crises, right? Which we know quite well. And looking at it from a feminist perspective, or from a woman's perspective, or gender perspective, if you want, I'd like to reflect on a couple of points, which, as I said, connects deeply with the sort of work we've been doing and the experience that we have on the continent. So there are two particular things I'd like to pick up on. One is, why are women's or feminist perspectives so central in the just energy transition in Africa? And the second is, then what does this mean for building a just energy transition in Africa? So I think we're all quite aware about the fact that Africa is still quite rural based. In fact, a majority of people are still rural based, and they're actually peasant woman farmers who make up the majority of sort of farmers across the region, who make the majority of peasant farmers as well across the region. And so when we look at that, we sort of start to understand how fundamentally tied to the land women actually are. In fact, they are, in some ways, we call them stewards of nature, I suppose. And because of their gender prescribed roles as well, for collecting water, for cooking, for tending to energy needs, or collecting fuel for their families and their communities, tending to the sick, so being the carers for their communities as well, they really do understand quite fundamentally and intimately how we are how we are connected to and are interdependent on nature, and how humans are actually just part of this bigger ecosystem that we have, and they understand how we need to live in harmony with nature. Some might even say, and a more radical view is that we are still actually nature itself. We're part of nature. And in fact, we just need to try and sort of get back into harmony with our position in nature as well. And women, and particularly women peasant farmers across the African region, understand these relationships, understand these interdependencies very, very well. As I said, particularly because of their nature, sort of their relationship to nature, as I was saying, being sort of stewards of nature, being sort of understanding how sort of the ecosystem works and how the life cycle works, and how much you need to actually protect nature in order for it to be sustaining and sustainable for us on this planet. So obviously when land is grabbed, and other resources are grabbed by extractors, a lot of the time, often by large, dirty energy projects. This tends to impact quite profoundly on women and their communities. We also have to consider these other patriarchal sort of norms, particularly in Africa, where women don't, even though they are sort of stewards of land and sort of have this relationship to land, they don't own land. So they don't have ownership of land. That's usually held by men in the community, or held by traditional leaders, which are also men in the communities. And so when these resources are grabbed, or when land is grabbed by such projects, dirty energy projects, for example, you know, they sold off, basically, rather than grab. Let's say they sold off to men who end up leaving the area with these finances, and leaving women and the communities that they support in a really, really dire situation. If you add in the climate crisis to this really potent and terrible mix, you know, you can also see the other particular vulnerabilities that women in their communities face. Those women, obviously, who make up the majority of peasant women farmers across the region, who are tied to the land. So the link between climate change or the climate crisis and energy projects makes the situation for women particularly precarious. So if we can add on more injury to insult when you bring in the so-called energy transition, because the way in which the so-called green energy revolution has been rolled out or has been implemented across the region has not been in a way that actually benefits women and their communities, to put it lightly. In fact, it sort of exacerbates their precarious situation, because the way in which the sort of green energy revolution, or green energy transition, let's call it, is actually implemented, is done in very, very problematic ways. And in fact, it's done in ways that actually are very much in parallel to or replicate the old ways in which sort of these large dirty energy projects have actually been implemented as well. So what we're seeing, a few of the features in which some of this energy transition is actually happening, which is very, very problematic. The one thing is that we are seeing that there's a lot of these very large scale renewable energy projects that are being implemented, privately owned, usually for profit. And the energy itself does not benefit women on the ground, women in rural areas. It actually goes to the urban areas, it goes to the elite, it goes to the mining areas, it goes to industry. So it leaves people out. And then what's worse, obviously, another thing is that, as I was alluding to earlier, is that resources are actually grabbed from women and their communities in order to implement these renewable energy projects, these large-scale renewable energy projects. So there's more land and water grabs that we've seen with dirty energy projects like coal and oil and gas, for example, displacing women and their communities, and in fact creating new, what we call sacrifice zones. So basically, you've been fed a so-called development narrative that some people have to be sacrificed for the greater development good of the country or of the region. And so the very people who actually really need access to energy, who need this energy justice, are those that are left out, and not just left out, but are really sort of left out in the cold. In the cold and, let's say, in the dark, I suppose, as well. The other issue that I think was alluded to by other speakers was this issue about mining for new green minerals in Africa. There's a new scramble for Africa, which is based around this green energy revolution, and is something that is, again, extremely destructive. I think Professor Claude had spoken about, the sort of rush for resources during colonialist times, and we're seeing this new rush for resources in Africa, sort of plundering Africa's resources and taking it over to the global north with this new green energy revolution as well. So you're finding here that, well, China's leading this, but obviously Europe and the US are also jockeying for power in all of this as well, jockeying for power over these new green minerals in Africa. So creating more and more sacrifice zones as well, trying to get these new green minerals that can end up sort of going into electric cars in the global north, or into solar panels and wind farms and so on. So we really have to pay attention to sort of the scale and the nature of this of the green minerals transition as well. It's the new green extractivism, right? So we've had extractivism as we know it, but now the green and new extractivism as well, which is deeply, deeply problematic. And as I said, all of this is sort of really leaving out women. We have to really talk about sort of who benefits and who's left out of this transition as well. And I want to just particularly point to, and I'll be sort of concluding soon, but I wanted to also particularly point out to this new rush for gas as well. We know that now gas is being portrayed as a transition fuel as well. There's a new rush for gas across the African continent as we are seeing it at the moment, particularly in affecting frontier countries, so countries where there's never been gas exploration before. And behind all of this are two things, I would say. One is the new geopolitics that is emerging because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as we know, which is leading to sanctions with Russia. So Europe now wants to sort of rush into Africa to sort of get our gas from it. And some of our governments are even getting behind this because they're saying that, we should, it's our opportunity here to be able to exploit gas so that we can develop our countries. But gas is absolutely not a transition fuel. it has been there's been lots of critique against gas as a so-called transition fuel, and it's really just the old dirty energy actors who are trying to portray gas in a new clean and green fashion. Gas, there is no such thing that we will just use gas as well if we start exploiting it just for the next couple of years, and then we can quickly get into solar and wind and other forms of green energy, because in order for it to be profitable, the infrastructure would need to be developed for at least 40 to 60 years, which, as we know, in terms of the climate crisis, will take us way beyond 1.5 degrees. And if we look at what actual scientists are saying, it at least to a 3 or 4 degree world. And for Africa, that means an even higher increase in temperatures. So I just wanted to dispel that myth that gas is now also going to be part of this new just energy transition. It certainly isn't, and it's certainly going to cause all of the other problems that I've been speaking about before. And then just also finally, touching on the new green hydrogen fad as well. There's a lot of issues around green hydrogen. It's coming in at a very rapid speed. It's also based around a lot of the other arguments that couch the ideas around gas, and then these massive renewable energy or solar farms and so on as well, because green hydrogen and the exploitation and building of infrastructure of that in Africa at the moment, as we're seeing, is all meant actually not for Africa itself, but is meant for export to Europe primarily and to other countries in the global north. So the investments from the global north, which are not even a lot, in fact, our countries themselves have to build the infrastructure around green hydrogen. But the actual energy that goes out will be going out to Europe. So it doesn't benefit Africa really in any real way. And obviously will particularly not help women and their communities. So, I mean, what does this really mean then for the just transition in Africa? And I just wanted to point to just a couple of things. This is by no means, giving you a full picture of sort of what needs to happen and what needs to be done. But certainly when we look at of sort of the impacts of this energy transition on women and their communities, then we need to, and the fact that because of, as I said, patriarchal norms, which leaves women's voice out of decision making on a lot of these issues around the energy transition, then we need to start thinking about putting women at the center of actually proposing some of these alternatives, to have their voices heard so that we can actually center their needs going forward. And redressing, as Christabel was saying, a lot of these other injustices that we're talking about. We also need to start valuing and sort of and centering sort of the work and the care work and so on that women actually do, and start redistributing those tasks, because only in doing that will there be real justice really as well for women as well. We always, of course, we need to start framing the energy challenge from a gender or a feminist perspective. We need to centrally address the issues of ownership of land and the ownership of other resources, so that it is not privately held, so that it is in the trust of those who are really those who are actually growing the food and are actually those who are tied closest to the land. We also need to think about the issue of this climate debt, and we're talking about finances that are not reaching Africa. But climate debt is essential when we're talking about the just energy transition. Who is going to fund this energy transition, and for whose benefit is it actually going to be funded as well? And climate debt addresses this finance issue from a justice perspective, because women in the communities in Africa have not caused the climate crisis, as we know, but are those that are facing the impacts. And so those who have actually caused the climate crisis need to finance the transition, this just energy transition in Africa. And really, we need to stop, I'll have this as the last point, but we need to stop this idea about tinkering around the margins, this idea about this green energy revolution that is still very much embedded in the ideologies of the existing modern economy, this existing development model that we know, as I said before, has caused the climate crisis that we face today, and all of the other crises that the interlocking crises as well that we face. And so we need to look at overall system change. We need to look at a transition away from the actual system that has caused the climate crisis when we're looking at the energy transition as well. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Trusha. A lot of rich information that you've shared. Critical issues around the lack of transparency, meaningful participation, of communities in this conversation, and who is really driving the new alternative energy sources. I would, at this stage, like to really bring in the participants, and I'm just going to read out a few of the comments that have come through, and then I'll open it up to the panelists to just respond to those questions, and also just reflect on some of the comments that have come through, as we are drawing close to the end of this conversation. So there's a comment that has come through from Neva Jerry, who's talking about industrial development models that spell out the use of coal and steel for manufacturing, and how can low-income countries really catch up with the other more developed countries without using renewable energy, without using coal or oil. So I think it's, how do we make that transition? And I think, Alex, you could touch on that as you were sharing from the South African perspective as well. The other comment is from Jabu, who's saying they love Trusha, that you're such a great speaker. So just to let you know, and Jabu was saying that you're making some very critical points in your intervention. From Florence, she's asking how can Africa reconcile poverty and the growth of the African industry, looking at the aspect that the majority of Africans still rely on wood forest for energy to cook. So how do we reconcile all those aspects? A question from Raymond Muchemwa, who's a question for Claude, that we have abundant mineral deposits in Africa, but why is it that the continent is not benefiting from these resources? Is it a governance issue? I have noted insurgencies and instabilities in the region with much needed mineral resources. What are the causes for these instabilities, like we've seen in the Cabo Delgado in Mozambique? Then from Rachel, she says, I feel there is more to be done in Africa. For us to attend the transition agenda towards renewable energy. Then another comment, I'll summarize the comment from Malvin Daka, who says our biggest challenges as Africans in Southern Africa and in South Africa are facing challenges in their country as relates to the source of energy, which is being fossil fuels, and how will we transition to renewable energy? So I think it's just raising the critical issues that we are already facing a number of challenges with the current status quo. So how do we move into renewable energy whilst we still have all these challenges? Another question from Raymond to Alex, with the current load shedding in South Africa and the independent energy producers playing a critical role in alleviating the energy crisis in South Africa, will the independent energy producers play a critical role in alleviating the energy crisis in South Africa, and are there any steps being done at a large scale to incorporate these independent energy producers on the power grid? I think the last comment from Sydney, it says we need to make a string of different kinds of policy frameworks, I think, to support this just transition agenda and obviously adopt a feminist approach. There were also questions from Tandeka, who's asking, I think this question is for Alex, can biomass energy in the agriculture sector help to reduce load shedding? And can it be incorporated in the just energy transition agenda? So I'll open it up to our panelists to respond to some of those questions, and also just to reflect on some of the interventions from the other panelists. I'll start with you, Alex.
Great. And just quickly repeat that last one about biomass.
So the last question was whether biomass energy in the agriculture sector can help to reduce load shedding.
Right. Okay, I'll get to that one in the end. I want to try, I mean, we've only got a few minutes, so I want to try and make a few high-level comments, also reflecting on the conversations or the presentations from the previous speakers. Africa as a region has an energy supply problem, and lack of energy access has a cost at a macro level for the economy as a whole. It also has a cost right down to village level. We've heard the references to rural communities, to women, to really the household level. We've got to recognize that in a lot of rural environments in Africa, primary energy production is charcoal, is wood fuel, and that has obvious environmental costs, but I think much more directly, the costs in terms of health for our rural African communities and for women in Africa is very extreme. So I absolutely agree that energy access is a major challenge and an imperative for the continent. I also agree that our region obviously comes from a history of exploitation, and that the way that power is expressed at economic and social and political levels, whether it's the north-south, whether it's in the country, in terms of local elites, even within the household, if we're thinking about certain levels at which the gender dynamics obviously plays a role, not to say that it doesn't play a role at those other levels. So yes, we need power. We need electricity. Yes, we do need to be cautious of exploitation. And there are costs related to the energy transition. I mean, we wouldn't have a debate around a just energy transition if that wasn't the case. So the very fact that we're talking about a just transition implies that yes, there are costs. And as I said, we need to seek ways to minimize the costs and to maximize the opportunities related to the transition. So for example, yes, there are problems in terms of land grabs, in terms of pushing communities off land for large-scale renewable energy investments. Those challenges are not unique to the renewable energy sector, as I think Trisha mentioned. We've seen the same thing happening in fossil fuel-based sectors, in mining sectors, and all sorts of developments. So I think just the narrative that I want to make sure that the point is clear is energy is needed. We need to increase energy access. We need to be cautious of exploitation. But I think the next jump that is sometimes implied, sometimes said explicitly, is that because there are costs related to renewable energies, or because we need this energy now, therefore we should be cautious, or we should move more slowly, or perhaps reject the narrative that a transition towards renewables is necessary. So that's where I would part ways, and I would say we need the energy transition. Africa is extremely vulnerable. We know historically Africa is not responsible for global carbon emissions at any significant scale. But Africa is very vulnerable to climate change right now and will increasingly be so in the future. And I would also say that one could point to large-scale renewable energy investments as an example of an extension of this abuse of power and abuse of power by elites, pushing people off land, power being directed only to the powerful, the economic elites, rather than the rural community. But it's very much about how you use that power. There are just as many examples within our continent and within other developing regions around how off-grid renewable energy solutions or grid-based renewable energy solutions can be used to bring power directly to to rural communities, and in fact empower communities, disempowered people, women also in our communities, in very significant ways. So I think we need to be very cautious, as much as we need to be realistic, and we shouldn't sugarcoat the fact that this transition will have costs. We need to be cautious of implying or even stating specifically that because there are costs, we shouldn't move ahead with this transition. I think the conclusion we should draw from this is that we should not be naive, that Africa does need to be clear about its agenda. It needs to be clear about who benefits, and it needs to be very clear about any sort of deals we make, whether it's with foreign investors or foreign governments, to ensure that the region benefits. This plays out also in the green minerals or the critical minerals debate. It's true that China, Europe, the US are very explicit about the fact that they are seeking reliable supply of critical minerals to channel into their own green economy industries and their renewable energy production. Now, Africa needs a response to that. We need to be clear about our own agenda. We need to be clear that we want to ensure that that production value chain and that the jobs, the skills, the investment comes to our region. I wouldn't agree that I mean, we do have policy frameworks. So the Africa Climate Change Strategy was adopted earlier this year. Last year we had the AU Green Recovery Action Plan. I'm not suggesting that these policy frameworks are perfect, but there are policy frameworks, and there is to a degree, I would say, a coherent narrative emerging from the continent about what Africa wants. And it's very important that we drive these discussions through various forums, including the global climate change negotiations, the COP processes. And remember that, you know, as much as climate finance tends to dominate the discussions in terms of Africa's needs in the context of global climate negotiations, if you look at the Paris agreements, it's not just about climate finance. It speaks to capacity building. It speaks to technology transfer. And it's very much, again, up to our region to ensure that the governance frameworks are in place, and that the political messaging is coherent and direct enough to ensure that that those commitments that are already there do actually feed into direct benefits for the continent. Mm-hmm. There was a question, very quickly, just a question. So there was a question about, if you look historically, you know, economic development has come through iron and steel production. Again, I would raise a caution there. I would be very cautious of saying that, you know, or let me put it this way, we should be careful of trying to achieve development in the 21st century by using 20th century development models. The locus of competition, the rules of the game the strength of and the dynamism of economies and innovation is increasingly lying within green economy, fourth industrial revolution, circular economy. And again, as I said, this is not just about dealing directly with an environmental issue. It is also about thinking about how the continent positions itself strategically in terms of where the global economy is moving. And yes, while we do that, absolutely, there is a need to question narratives, to look at power relations and how these are played out. The question on biomass, very quickly. So the South African sugar industry, for example, is already self-sufficient in energy production because it uses biomass to produce its own energy. Obviously, you know, there's potential there, but there's a lot of caveats, and I want to be cautious of going into that because obviously, when you're talking about biomass, it has to do with, are you using land that could potentially be used for agricultural production, for food production? So you've got to look at implications there. There's a whole argument about, yes, you know, what kind of crops we're using, what kind of biomass, are we using marginal land that in any event wouldn't be available for food production? So, I mean, my answer very briefly would be a very cautious yes, but there are a lot of caveats to that that we won't have time to go into.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to ask from the participants if you can allow us for another 5-10 minutes to just wrap up the session. So I'd just like to invite Claude to just respond to the questions, and then Tricia.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Look, my sense is that if we are going as a continent to meet our commitment to the Paris Agreement, because we've committed, we are out of time for incremental solutions. We will need to switch to emergency mode. So if we had option, because we've committed, we will need to stop burning fossil fuels today. But it's also very correct that if we stop today, we'll jeopardize livelihood. Just as it's difficult for Europe and the United States in the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where we've seen the going back to fossil fuels. Germany is talking about reopening old coal mines, including Britain. We've seen Europe going to Iran, pushing Iran to produce more oil. Venezuela also. So we've seen this contradictory attitude toward the Paris Agreement. So just as it's difficult for Europe and US to move out of this fossil fuel, it will be even more difficult and challenging for Africa to transit from fossil fuels. The continent is in debt distress, has no finances, has no technology. I think those are facts we need to have. And that's why when I speak about policy articulation, is a policy that is driven by people's, the women, the rural people, concerns. So the point we have made is that Africa needs to put in place plans and strategies for that transition to happen. If it can happen sooner, the better. This is why our work in the promotion of good governance of natural resources, remember that geopolitics around these critical minerals is not because there is need, the first instant in that geopolitics around these critical minerals, it is to solve outside problems than to solve African problems. So the entire discussion around within the Paris Agreement, and that's why I'm saying we need a movement that is driven by people to ensure what people have committed to are in fact implemented. Because that issue of financing energy transition, new technology transfer has been there for years. But we've seen the reluctance of those who are supposed to provide that, to make it easier for those things to happen. My sense is that a just transition for Africa should be considered at 4 levels. One, and this is to respond also to the question of why we have abundant resources, but we can't. The continent is not benefiting, and so on. There are issues of governance internally, lack of transparency, corruption, and so on. The insurgency we are seeing in Mozambique, the war in the east of the Congo, which has been there for years, especially the war in the Congo, is about resources. And the argument, and it's very clear, that war has not been created by Congolese, but it was provoked by forces outside Congo. So without going into that argument, my 4 levels I wanted to provide is that we need to promote the beneficiation and value addition of critical minerals to secure a locally driven energy transition. That, I think, the first thing. And when we say locally driven energy transition, it simply means, is it possible for Africa also to be exporting technology? Why should we have abundant mineral resources and not using them? The African Continental Free Trade Agreement has opened up the market. Africa is a 1.4 billion people that need access to clean energy, and we have the resources to produce that. Why don't we put energy in doing that? This is possible. Africa is the producer power of critical minerals. Today, because there are no other alternative, because I know there's work being done to see how we can have new technology that some of these minerals, cobalt, lithium, and so on, and some studies are very advanced. But today, without Africa minerals, it's practically impossible to achieve the energy transition. So there is need for a paradigm shift in the way from a model where we export these raw materials to a model where we become a producers of finished goods and export them. I think that is an important. The second point, quickly, Chair, I know we don't have time, is putting people at the center of the transition. And this is important, and participate in the design of approaches to energy transition. We need to build a movement. The transition should not leave people, communities behind in the discussion, not just in benefits. Because if we have designs that have left people out in terms of input, sometimes you get it wrong. So we are arguing, we are requesting for people-centered policy and articulation. So the protection of women's rights is critical. Access to land, because accessing these critical minerals is going to push people out of their land. And we know that mining by nature abuses human rights. We are going to see the increase of human rights abuses. So we need to invest in monitoring this sector to ensure that we protect the rights of women to livelihood, to people, especially the marginalized, but also we need to ensure that there is respect for human rights. But indeed, we need transparency and accountability along the value chain. One of the biggest challenges we have as we try to position ourselves in the global economy, we need to resolve our internal weaknesses. And those weaknesses are around very serious opacity in the way we are dealing with these resources. So my sense is that those will be a reaction to some of these to these questions. But really, we need to really be very clear how we should do how we should transit to clean energy. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Claude. Thank you. Trusha, bring us home in 2-3 minutes.
Thanks, Cristobal. I know we have run out of time, actually. So I really don't want to add too much more to what the other panelists have said. Maybe just a slightly different perspective, and I'm sure it's probably going to be the subject for your next dialogue. But just to sort of reflect on the sort of international climate negotiations at the moment and the state that it is in. I mean, I think, you know, with the way the climate negotiations have gone and the trajectory that it's going in as well is not promising at all. And so I hate to leave with a cynical perspective, but leave you all with that cynical perspective, sorry. But really, the climate negotiations, as we know, has been dominated by certain voices. It has been captured by corporates, with last year having the biggest contingent of transnational corporations being within the negotiating space. Governments of the global north do not want to take action. They are trying everything that they possibly can to delay action, to try and greenwash their efforts as well. And so this idea that we are able to sort of really get into this just energy, not even a just energy transition, we even just able to transition in terms of energy is looking pretty bleak, I would say. And when you add justice into it, I think it's even bleaker. So when you look at fossil fuels, for example, I think even the professor was saying, you know, we are seeing now with the new geopolitics that fossil fuels is very much at the center of what's being actually pushed. And I mean, it's still drill, baby, drill. And every last bit of oil that can be drilled, that's going to happen until we see the end, at least of human civilization with this. So we know that fossil fuels need to end and end now. No new expansion at all, and then a managed phase out of existing fossil fuel infrastructure, but we are not going in that direction at all. And that, of course, that continued expansion as well and retention of the fossil fuel infrastructure is also what's going to prevent us from doing this energy transition. So as long as we have those power dynamics in play that keep these options still very, very much in play, we're really not going to see that transition. We were told many years ago that all we need to do is wait for renewable energy to become, you know, more competitive, for the prices to come down, and then it will just kick off all of the other fossil fuel options. That's not actually happening at the moment. That's not the state of play, even though the prices actually have come down in terms of renewable energy. So what is needed? I mean, in the Glasgow Pact last year, at the last COP, they even changed the language from a phase out of coal, for example, to a phase down of coal. And then there's massive loopholes in terms of all of the different offsetting options, carbon offsetting, and different market-based solutions, so-called market-based solutions, net zero options, and a whole gamut of these kinds of things, which will definitely prevent a transition and delay a transition. And we don't have time we just don't have time to play with anymore. And so, but that is not being seen and being thought of. And certainly Africa does not have time to play with in terms of we're already experiencing the impacts. They're going to get worse. We're going to be pummeled by impacts, really. The temperatures are going to be soaring. And sort of, where's this transition? So I hate to end on that gloomy note, but I just wanted to present a little bit of the actual realities of what's going on, and the fact that there's self-interest at play. There's very, very vested interests in continuing things as they currently are. And unless we can put a wrench in that in some way, that there's a people-driven movement that pushes against this, that resists this, the status quo and so on, we're not going to be seeing the change that we need. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Trusha. You really brought us home. And I think I love the last statement that you made, that we do not have time and the action has to happen now. And some critical issues that have been raised from this conversation in terms of what is necessary. We need to be very clear, even in the context of the climate negotiation, who's going to benefit from this process. We've talked about putting people at the center. We need transparency. We need those mechanisms, to be effective, and we need accountability. Accountability is from the countries. Accountability is from the commitments that have been made by the global north. We need the protection of women's rights. That's very, very critical. I think the last point is, how do we move forward? These conversations, we are using these conversations to really bring all these critical issues ahead of the COP27, so that we could package all these conversations in terms of, these are citizens' positions, and these are things that need to be brought forth by African countries and in the different spaces that we are working in. I would like to take this opportunity to really thank our panelists and being part of this conversation. We will be sharing on our third conversation ahead of the COP27, and really looking at the climate negotiations, bringing in different key citizens groups, and what are the challenges that they're experiencing in relation to climate change, and what needs to be done. So thank you to everyone who was on this call. I also acknowledge comments that came through from Sharita and also from Henry, and we'll be able to pick up all these comments and conversations in our next session. And also for extending the time to be with us past 12:30. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much to everyone, and bye.